Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for our True Talk Thursday vodcast, the platform that encourages a thought-provoking conversation about topics centered around education. What's so neat about the vodcast is that you'll hear opinions, experiences, research, and ideas from various perspectives, but I want to remind you all that the views and opinions expressed tonight do not necessarily reflect that of Alas or NABSI. Now driving the conversation tonight, we have Dr. Maria Armstrong, who is the Executive Director of Alas, and Dr. Atiba-Weza, who is the Executive Director of NABSI, driving the conversation. And so Maria and Atiba, take it away.
Okay, Maria, I'm going to pick up on your last comment and going back to Cristina. When do you, Cristina, see those things that Maria mentioned in terms of how people address you? When do you, and how do you determine whether they're just ignorant, they really don't know what they're saying, and therefore they make what we might call an honest mistake? And then there are those times when it's deliberate because the term is being used as an insult or an unwillingness to respect you and how you wish to be addressed. And what do you do when those things occur?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of steps here. So one is, one always has the chance to simply ask somebody, how do you identify? Like that is a very common sort of move that we should incorporate. Just ask folks, like, how do you identify? Is it Latino, Latina, Hispanic? What is it, right? Given that we know how dynamic this population is, but in general, it's a great way to just get to know other folks too, right? And that starts a great conversation about who we are, how we see ourselves, and, could actually produce a nice groundswell of, cultural connectivity, right? That we so often lack across spaces. But I think one of the things to really think about is that I see as opportunities for creating harm is when you don't value the way then people want to express themselves, right? When you say, no, you're not Latinx, or no, we don't use it. You're only Hispanic. That's the only term we use here. Or no this, like that is real harm, I think. That is really sort of modeling exclusion. That is really sort of cutting down on individual creativity, things of the sort. And so that I would sort of really suggest against. And then be okay with the fact that folks have preferences, right? And those might not be your own preferences, but that's okay. The fact that different folks within the Latino community have different understandings is interesting. Like, we're a dynamic, interesting group of folk. It's not right or wrong per se. Now, we should study and understand the power of labels and sort of the cultural and, the cultural history behind them. Like, there's a real important task for understanding the idea of Hispanic as sort of tying us to Spain and tying us to a history of colonization that we often don't talk about, right? And there's a real important task standing then Latino as a response to that. Know your history, know that stuff, and then make up your mind. But also know that for the most part, folks walk around with understandings that they've developed from a variety of different ways, right? So some might just use Latinx a lot because they're younger and this is important to them and they have a gender politics. Let them use that. It's not wrong or right. It's interesting and it's an important way of understanding sort of intersectional politics that happen and sort of modes of individual expression. I think I would start there, right? With sort of making space for those conversations. And I actually think all groups need to make space for these conversations amongst each other. If you look at history, for example, for a long, long time, Hispanic was really just used in Texas and New Mexico. And in many ways, some people connected this automatically to their idea of Spain and sort of, I'm not indigenous, I'm not Native American, I'm from a Spanish family, call me Spanish origin, call me Hispanic. And other folks just used it because that's what they grew up using, right? That doesn't deny that there is a power politics and a real history behind them, but that also just sort of allows that space for people then to talk about it, to learn about it, and to come to their own conclusions, right? I think when we start sort of arguing about whether Latinx is right or wrong, or whether it's going to lead to some moral decay or outcome or whatever have you, it denies sort of the cultural expressivity that we could have in, one of the nation's most dynamic populations.
Well, all kinds of stuff are starting to bounce around in my head right now. So I've had, just like anybody else, I had conversations with different folks about this subject, right? I remember coming back after being in Puerto Rico for a year and a half, and I'm talking to some friends, and they're saying they're going to go to this conference. And I said, I think I used the term something about, I said Latino, and they, no, Maria, don't be using that anymore. You need, the trend now is Latinx. And I said, that's when I thought, oh, is that a generational, like Gen Z, And so they're like, no, this is what it means. And that's when it was like, okay. And that goes back to that original question, Cristina. Are these labels or these ways of identification, are they brought up by our own, or is it from the outside that is labeling us?
Yeah, I think it's both. Often, when Hispanic was used as the term that would be used in the census in the 1970s, a lot of that was championed by folks that called themselves Hispano in New Mexico and Colorado and Texas, even though this wasn't necessarily something that was used in Los Angeles or Sacramento or folks from there. It sort of came as the term, right? And then the government needed to put it on forms. And then we needed to show people, okay, that we're Puerto Rican, that might have been from New York, that we're from Miami, whatever. This is your term. So there's a way when it comes from here, and then it sort of comes from the top, right? And a lot of the resistance, in fact, in the 1990s, one of the most popular bumper stickers in Miami was said, "I'm Cuban, not Hispanic," right? Or, those Emiliano Zapata t-shirts that say, "I'm Mexican, not Hispanic," right? Yeah. And you see this because local identities are really important to people, especially their national identities and and so in some ways, all of these pan-ethnic identities like Hispanic, Latino, Latin American, Spanish origin, Latinx, like the list goes on. Do you want me to use raza, Spanish speaking, Spanish surname? You need to understand that this is just what happens to us. That this happens because at each point we're so dynamic and growing, and we hit against the racial politics of the nation, the gender politics of the nation, and we come back and we reflect on ourselves and we ask ourselves, what is the way that we want to express ourselves? And that's, in America, the youth have been so dynamic at championing new cultural points of view. Right? Look at the 1960s generations when we had red power, yellow power, Chicano power, brown power movements. Those were from, black power movements. Those were formed by the youth. It was like the Generation Z from back then. Yeah. Right? It wasn't the folks, 40 and above or things like that. It was the youth. And we look back on that and we think of them as, real cultural pioneers. And I think in many ways we're seeing some of this. Social media amplifies it from the bottom up real quick, like that, way more than we've ever seen before. So in many ways, a term that might have maybe not made it, or a term that might have sort of had a blip and then died down, is sort of widely recognized right now because of social media. And that's really important, right? Yeah. And so, to think that this doesn't happen to us, or to think that, we're using a new term, oh no, we're going to fracture and we're going to destabilize and we won't be here anymore, isn't true. We've always used new terms, always. The list goes on and on.
But you're right, because through generations, it has changed. And, and I talk to, folks that are older than me. And I talk to folks that are younger than me, and the older ones, they're like, and myself included, I was a youngin' when we were talking Chicano power, and that was our, we held our ground on that, which is why many of them, they're like, oh heck no, I am not signing up for Latinx. You know why? Because then you're going to erase Chicanos And we fought way too hard to even identify as that and be accepted as that. So there's this hold.
Yeah.
I was down in Kansas not too long ago, and they're like, we only use the term Hispanic out here. Do you know how long it took us for that to be even, for us to be identified? There's no way we're switching. I mean, all of this, you're right. There's a historical attachment, but it doesn't have to be an exclusive or detachment, I guess.
Yeah, one of the ways that you're talking about is just fundamentally, what we call panethnic politics. Fundamentally, I fought to be Chicano. Well, for most people, Chicanos, Mexican Americans. For some people, it could be Mexican American and Central American, but oftentimes it's not really folks from the Caribbean or South American, right?
Yes.
So what you're talking about is sort of a national identity. And the term, it could be the term Latinx that's a threat to it, but it could also be Latino, it could also be Hispanic, it could also be sort of the sense of don't erase me by bringing me part of the whole. That's been forever. And that's been with whatever term. You want to use the term brown, you want to use the term raza, you want to use the term Spanish origin, you're going to have that tension. People will always want to say, I'm Boricua or I'm Puerto Riqueño before they will say Latino. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that something like Latinidad isn't meaningful. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, we look at the data and at least in California, K through 12 public school population is, 58%. And yet Latinos at UC Berkeley are still only 15%. It doesn't mean, that's a real pattern.
Yep.
So call it Latinidad, call it, Latinx, call it whatever you want. That's still real. And so we've got to be able to create space for difference. And we've got to be able to create space and recognize that difference, right? We need to recognize, as they did in the 1970s, that Cubans thought of things differently than, for example, Mexicans. We've got to be able to recognize, and we're in different had different racial histories. Mexican Americans were lynched often, subjects of racial terror on the Texas-Mexico border. It's not necessarily a history that the Mariel sort of Cuban refugee population of the 1970s or not the pre-Mariel had, right? Everyone has its own history, and we should be able to create that space. And at the same time, we should also be able to recognize that Latinidad as a whole has often been seen as not completely accepted in the United States. That this idea of America, the American fabric, right, with its racial exclusions, with its racial hierarchy, has often booted out Latinos en masse together as not entirely inclusive of them. And so you've got to reconcile with that.
Yeah.
You've got to put these two together. However, and if we're going to stay on sort of the politics of what we call ourselves, that's important. And don't lose sight of this other thing as well.
Yeah.
The timing for this is critical in that the president will be certifying shortly the census and who is counted and how people are counted. So this is not unimportant. But we go back, in addition to that, in 1970, the great Algerian liberation psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who incidentally was born in Martinique in the Eastern Caribbean, talked about language, racial, ethnic identity, and its role in resisting oppression and as a tool for liberation. And excuse me, he was writing in the context of Algeria, where the French in Algeria had a pecking order based on a number of factors, but one of them is how we speak, how well did the Africans speak the French language? How did they identify? And that in many ways determined their place in society, among other factors that we use. How do you see that playing out among, I remember Maria and I about a few weeks ago, I was referencing a trip she said she had made to Puerto Rico. So I just made an assumption she was Puerto Rican. Said, oh, I'm not Puerto Rican. A lot of people think I am. So how does that play out in the context of this discussion and your research in terms of self-identity
Yeah.
versus
But-
identity by what might be perceived as an oppressor class and what that means for the community as a whole.
But we're going to take a break and come back and let Cristina answer that question.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.